Okay, we can start earlier than we normally do at the AA because we're normally waiting for people to come. But since both halls are filled, we can start now. And I'm very pleased because it's Adrian 40 teaching, lecturing this evening. I see faces not only from here, but also from the Bartlett. And Adrian obviously teaches at the Bartlett as professor, but has always been a friend to the AA, and we're extremely pleased to welcome him. For those who maybe have just joined the AA, you will probably know Adrian better through his through the book Words and Buildings, which has established itself in architectural education as an extremely important text. And he and I were saw in China that it's referred to by kind of everyone. He has written various texts which have been important in architectural history and discussion. And tonight is going to talk about concrete and culture. I think especially when it says a material history, it always introduces a sort of certain ambiguity. If it was a materialist history, then the concrete would, as it were, be less concrete. One of the problems is some people want to know, is he talking about concrete, as in the substance, or concrete as the opposite of the abstract? It's interesting that materialism means that he would be talking about the abstract version of concrete, but the material history talks about the concrete version of concrete. So I'm very, very pleased to be able to welcome him here to talk in this series, which is, I may have said to you before, is to kind of try and open out broad themes which are of interest to an architectural school without sort of pretending that it's the latest algorithm which will solve all problems of design forevermore, but actually to look at enduring problems which probably can't be solved but won't be going away either. So with that, Adrian, welcome, and thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for inviting me here this evening. As Mark has said, I'm going to talk about this project called Concrete and Culture, which is shortly to be released as a book. And in fact, you can already buy it on Amazon, but it doesn't exist yet, so it'll be interesting to see what happens if you try. Okay, I'm going to start by saying a little bit about the history of this project and explaining some of the ideas that lie behind it, and then I'm going to give you a synoptic view of what it's about. Let me explain that I started working on this and thinking about it in the late stages of writing the book called Words and Buildings, which Mark has already mentioned. Let me say in a shameless piece of self-promotion that Words and Buildings is being reissued and will be back in the bookshops next month or on Amazon next month. So it's been out of print for a couple of years, but it's going to be back in print, I'm pleased to say. Anyway, I started thinking about this topic of concrete in the late stages of working on Words and Buildings. Words and Buildings was a book that was written from the library and the study, if you like. I spent a lot of time sitting in my room at home reading things. And one of the things I wanted to do was to get out more. I thought it'd be interesting to do something which gave me a reason to get out and indeed go anywhere I wanted to go. And concrete seemed to offer that. And but also it was an escape from dealing with the fugitive world of language. I thought I wanted to deal with something that had substance. And again, concrete seemed to offer a route to thinking about something that would be the opposite of language. How wrong I was. Anyway, we'll see. So that's how it started. Now, I'm not the first person to have written a book about concrete. There are lots of others in the bookshops and on the bookshelves. But I did want to do something that would be different. And at the risk of boring you for a few minutes, I'm going to tell you about some of the things that were on my mind and that I wanted to do that would be not like other books about concrete. And the first thing that really preoccupied me was that concrete is a global medium. It's everywhere. And this indeed is part of its interest. Now, virtually all existing studies of concrete think about it in relation to one particular country or one particular part of the world. It's quite difficult. Well, there isn't anything which really engages with its global characteristic. So I wanted to try and think about this, to try and see how one might talk about and discuss concrete without tying it down to any particular nationality or locality. Concrete's everywhere, and I wanted to make that part of the subject. Now, most of the interest, most of what's being written about concrete concentrates on its technical properties, an interest in its various techniques, steel reinforcement, shell structures, slag cements, carbon reinforcement, and so on. There's a whole catalogue of technical innovations that have made it what it is. Now, I'm not saying these aren't interesting, but to me, more interesting than its physical properties are its metaphysical properties. That is to say, I'm interested in the place that it occupies inside our heads. What is it doing in our minds? If we think back 120 years ago, concrete wasn't there. And now it's everywhere. And the question to me is, how has it become fitted into the way in which we think about the world? Did it displace something else that used to be there in our heads? Has it occupied a new place? What are the characteristics of that new place that it occupies within our minds? So that kind of lies behind my way of approaching it. And often when I was working on this, people would say, oh, where are you starting? You're starting with the Romans? And the answer is no, I wasn't starting with the Romans. And to me, the starting point is this quotation from Thomas More's Utopia, which was written in 1516. And he describes the houses of the utopians as follows. Homes, handsome appearance with 3 stories, exposed facades of the walls made of stone or cement or brick, rubble being used as filling for the empty space between the walls. The roofs are flat and covered with a kind of cement which is cheap, but so well mixed that it is impervious to fire and superior to lead in defying the damage caused by storms. Now, what More had done here is to imagine concrete some 400 years before it had actually been invented. So it's clear that it has occupied a place in people's minds independently of its physical existence. So that to me is intriguing, and I wanted to think about that. Now, a lot of people don't like concrete very much. It's, on the whole, had a rather bad press as a building material. It's unpopular at least in certain parts of the world and amongst certain classes of people. Now, I wanted to not to fall into the trap of trying to persuade people otherwise. Most of the existing books that have been written about concrete are, in one way or another, try to persuade people that although they might not think they don't like concrete, it tries to persuade them that really they do. And I didn't want to find myself writing another apology for concrete. It seemed more interesting to acknowledge that people find it horrible and repulsive, and if anything, to try and understand this rather than try to deny it or explain it away. So this, to me, has been a question that's been nagging me. I wanted to, in some way, deal with the disgust that it arouses and to see what one might be able to say about it. Now, again, most books about concrete are about the work of architects and engineers. They concentrate on things done by either architects or engineers. It seemed to me important to recognize that quite a lot of the concrete that is used in the world is not touched by architects or engineers. It's handled by people who aren't professionals. But also, there are people in many other occupations who make use of concrete for reasons of their own. So politicians, we might say, photographers, filmmakers, artists, writers, sculptors, and so on. And I wanted to think about what concrete means as a medium within their practices, as well as the practices of architects and engineers. So trying to kind of enlarge the field within which it occurs. Now, as a piece of research, one of the things that's preoccupied me is the way in which architectural historians find it much easier to talk about a document or a drawing or a photograph than they do to talk about a building. And this seems to me, there are good reasons for this, but it seems to me to be a problem. And if architectural history, which is the discipline that I belong to, has any value, validity as a discipline, it seems to me that it must be able to interrogate works and to derive its, whatever it has to say, from the examination of the works. So I wanted to see how far it was possible to develop an argument and a discussion around concrete that was actually based on the examination of the works themselves. So that to me has been quite important, was actually been to investigate the objects, to touch them and smell them and so on. Most of the other books about concrete turn out, when you look at them, to be case studies. They usually actually end up as a catalogue of case studies of lots of concrete buildings, sometimes in one country, sometimes in lots of countries. And this again seems to me to be rather unsatisfactory. I didn't want to fall into the trap of just another book of case studies. So that again, is something that's been, I've been thinking about how to avoid doing that. And then finally, the other preoccupation thing that was on my mind is that over the last 20 years or so, there's been a turn in architectural aesthetics towards seeing the value of architecture as lying in the way buildings are put together and what they're made of. And this is in distinction to the previous era, which tended to see what the thing represented as being more important than how it was made or what it was made of. Now, I'm not unsympathetic to this change, but at the same time, I wanted to examine the consequences of loading a material with the burden, if you like, of carrying the being of architecture. What does it mean to say that architecture lies in the material? And so, again, on my mind is really a kind of reflection on the implications of this and whether this is really sustainable as an intellectual proposition. And I probably don't have an answer to this, but it nevertheless seemed important to have something to say about it, which ultimately maybe I hope I do. Okay, so those are some of the general concerns that I've had. And what I'm going to do now is to describe to you the scheme of the whole thing. Now, what I could do would have been to talk to you about one bit of it in some detail, which would have been one way to fill the evening. But I thought it might be more interesting to try and give you a kind of synoptic view of the whole thing. And this is a bit of an experiment. I don't know whether this is going to work or not, really, but let's try it and see what happens. It may be frustrating in that I don't say enough about anything, but too bad. Well, that's what we're going to do. Let's try it. Now, what I realized in thinking about this fairly early on is that one of the characteristics of concrete is that it tends to double. You know, as soon as you say it's one thing, it's another thing. If you say it's liquid, it turns out to be hard, and so on. It always, you find that for every proposition about it, the opposite is true. This is, I'm not the first person to have noticed this, but I used this really as my kind of schema for thinking about it. And what I've done is to put forward a series of opposites, if you like, of paradigms through which one might explore and say something about what it is. And what I'm going to do really is to take you through these. These are the main ones that I've written about in the book. I'm going to take you through these and just say a little bit about what each one of them attempts to do or the problem, in some cases, that it identifies. And perhaps I should say at this stage that if I have an answer to the disgust that is provoked by concrete, it is in the fact that it manages to be so many things at once, and that it tends to slip between categories. As soon as you say it's advanced, it also turns out to be backward, and so on. And it's this tendency to be more than one thing at a time, not to fit and stay securely within the categories that we normally use to think about the world. That seems to me to be the essential cause of the loathing that many people have for it. That's a proposition which you may or may not want to agree with. Okay, well, let's take the first of these pairs, and this is the proposition that it's both advanced and backward. And this is something that is already suggested by the different names that the medium carries. So in the English language, it's called concrete, but in France and Germany, it's called béton. Concrete implies something that belongs in the world of the mind. It's a mental category that we use to distinguish what is abstract from what is solid. It implies that kind of mental distinction, or alternatively, maybe it suggests concretization of the drawing together of things to make something solid. But it is essentially something that belongs to a conceptual world. On the other hand, béton, which comes from an old French word meaning mass of rubble, rubbish lying in the ground, is rather different. It's this word béton is also the root for bitumen, and it clearly implies that the material that we're thinking about is earthbound in some way. It comes out of the ground, it's close to the ground. So this is a very different conceptual view of what the stuff is, and that distinction is immediately alerts us to some of the things that we will find. I like this image. This is of a permanently unfinished house in Crete, in which a seemingly traditional building has sprouted a modern frame on its top. It dreams, I suppose, of its modern past, which it's never going to become. We have a connection here between something that belongs to the future and something which is very much in the past, whatever this is, implies. Now, most of the time, we think about concrete as being an advanced medium. And a nice example of this is this little quotation from an essay by George Orwell, in which he makes this quite clear. On the one side, science, order, progress, internationalism, aeroplanes, steel, concrete, hygiene. On the other side, war, nationalism, religion, monarchy, peasants, Greek professors, poets, horses. Now, this isn't actually as commonsensical as you might think it is. The cement and concrete industry spends a great deal of time and effort in persuading us that concrete is an advanced material. But actually, it's always at risk of slipping back into some more atavistic, backward state. It's not a secure distinction. We're presented with images like this, which, with its extraordinary overhang, cantilever, its ingenuity of its engineering, may persuade us that concrete is indeed an advanced material that belongs to modernity. But actually, in large parts of the world, most of the time, concrete doesn't behave like this at all and occupies a relatively backward position. So this is a shanty town in Peru. This is a very basic structure in the process of being built by somebody who has no skill, particularly in construction probably, and employs no particularly sophisticated knowledge of engineering or the theory of structures. in this cases like this, one could hardly call it an advanced medium. This is the more normal condition in which probably the greater part of the concrete that is used in the world is consumed. And let me remind you just how much concrete is consumed in the world. We produce 3 tons of concrete every year for every person on the planet. And that is second only to water in the commodities, if you can call it that, that are produced in the world. It is second only to water in the amount that is produced. And obviously all sorts of questions follow from this. Where does it all go? Where does it all come from? Where did your 3 tons of concrete go last year? And so on. But I think, a significant proportion of it goes into places like this, where it's not particularly sophisticated. It's being used by inexpert people in fairly basic applications. Other people have commented on the archaism of concrete structures. The brilliant essay by Paul Virilio called Bunker Archaeology describes the atavism of the bunkers, which he sees as definitely being unmodern in their form. So there's clearly another discussion about concrete as being backward. If one looks at things like this, one man and a cement mixer can produce passably modern structures, but this is not a demonstration of an advanced technology. This is just an ordinary technology of poverty, really, being employed in many parts of the world. Now, this backwardness of concrete is not something that's normally acknowledged in discussions around concrete in the Western world. Were it to do so, were it to be acknowledged, it would threaten a lot of the premises upon which concrete is marketed and sold, and also quite a lot of the belief systems of engineers and architects. But from time to time, we do find people saying, actually, this is backward, and its backwardness is not uninteresting. So, for example, the Unité d'Habitation at Marseille, which you see under construction here, it's a building that was originally going to be built in steel, but the material was changed late in the day to concrete. And the concrete wasn't done very well. It was quite rough. And Le Corbusier seems not to have minded about this. And his own comments about the building say, well, actually, it is crude. It's precise in some ways, but it's crude in others. And he seems to have kind of recognized that it was both modern and unmodern in the way in which it used concrete, and not actually been particularly distressed about this, which is, as I say, quite unusual for an architect to have appreciated its backwardness. However, the case of somebody really making something of this is in, well, there are lots of cases, but this is one I'm going to talk about just for a few minutes. This is the School of Architecture at Sao Paulo in Brazil. And what it consists of is an enormous concrete box. You're just seeing a corner of it here, which extends quite a long way out into Bedford Square, and sits on these very spindly little legs. And then there's a big cantilever at the corner, so it overhangs a lot. And the wonder of this is between the massiveness of the box and the slenderness of the legs. And depending on from where you look at it, if you look at it under the colonnade here, the legs actually seem to turn into kind of needle points supporting the great box above. Now, the architect of this building, Villanova Artigas, seems to have been interested in wanting to make something that would be both backward and advanced. And he wanted to do this because in some way he wanted to represent the conditions of Brazil. Brazil, a country which has a superabundance of labor without any skill whatsoever, but also its other resource, apart from labor, is technical expertise, technical know-how. And what you see in this building is a conjunction between this roughness, if you like, which is what Brazilian labor can produce in unlimited quantities, just raw, rough stuff, with, on the other hand, something which is very clever and very sophisticated, which is the columns here, whose engineering and design and the ingenuity, as you see, with which they appear to disappear into nothing, is evidence of the skill of the architect and the engineer. So it's a way of showing, as it were, both sides of a culture which is both backward but also has the potential to be advanced. It's a commentary, if you like, on the material culture of Brazil as it was in the 1960s when this was built. Okay, so that's a little bit about the advanced and the backward. And what I've tried to show you is this sense in which both are there, though rarely acknowledged. Okay, the next of the two pairs, is around the natural and the unnatural. Now, most of the time, we assume that concrete is unnatural. After all, we talk about concreting over nature. What concrete seems to do is to either cover nature, it holds nature back, it protects us from nature. It's essentially something, a medium which counters nature. It resists nature in one way or another. Occasionally, as here, nature gets the better of it. But this is our normal way of thinking about it, of seeing concrete as something which is unnatural. The consequence of this is that we spend a great deal of time and trouble naturalizing concrete and giving it a face where it seems to belong to the natural world. So this is a public lavatory outside Notre Dame in Paris, finished in wood form with a thatched roof, although entirely made out of concrete. This is the sort of absurdity which the desire or compulsion to naturalize concrete sometimes has led people to. But there are other examples that are, if you like, more sophisticated, like this. This is the Lloyd's building in London, where this is a concrete building, but it is finished as if it were a steel and cast iron building. So again, what might be seen as the nastiness of concrete, its unnaturalness, is acculturated by making it into something that we find more acceptable, in this case, steel. And the world is full of these examples. I mean, most of the time, people try to make concrete look either like wood or more usually like stone. and an enormous amount of time and trouble is spent by people trying to render concrete and make it seem as if it's a sort of stone. And this is a kind of long-running story. But as well as this question as to whether an unnatural material can be made natural or not, there's another aspect to this question of the unnaturalness of concrete. And I think this is perhaps can be illustrated by this. This is still from a film called Point Blank. It's made in the 1960s, a John Boorman film. And you see Lee Marvin here standing on the bed of the Los Angeles River. Very briefly, the story, the plot of this film is that Walker, who's the character played by Lee Marvin, is crossed. He's a gangster. He's crossed by his accomplices following a robbery, and his share of the robbery is taken by the other people in the gang. And the whole film is the story of him trying to recover the $92,000 that he believes are owed to him. And many of the encounters that take place in the film take place in environments of concrete, under freeways, in riverbeds, etc., etc. And what's quite clear is that concrete here is used in the same way as the desert is used in cowboy films, in westerns. That these concrete environments are the environments within which people are tested, which is what the desert is for in the Western. So in other words, we have here another nature, that these environments of concrete are used in order to create another second nature, an urban nature, if you like, within which the scenes of the film are set. So we can say that what we see in these encounters is a sort of second nature. Now, this is particularly the case with this Los Angeles River scene. What happens is, towards the end of the film, he's finally identified the top man in the criminal organization. He's persuaded him to give him his $92,000. The guy's agreed, says, you go down to the river and pick it up from there. Walker suspects correctly that this is a trap, and gets Carter, who's the big guy, to go down with him, forces him at gunpoint to walk down to the riverbed to pick up the package. The henchman, who's up on the bridge with a rifle, shoots Carter, not having realized which man is which because it's too far away. And Walker then steps out from hiding in a culvert to pick up his package, discovers that, in fact, the package only contains blank pieces of paper, kicks it into the river, and it floats away. The river itself is an extraordinary feat of hydrological engineering and was very controversial in its day. It's the largest hydrological project ever undertaken in the United States, and effectively channeled this river, which tended to flood into this narrow riverbed. And there's a whole story around the making of this river. So this choice of setting for the final scene of the film is highly charged. This is a very carefully contrived piece of second nature. So this is the sort of discussion that I'm interested in, is how we actually reinterpret concrete environments into being a second nature. Okay, the next of these themes, this is about the historical and the unhistorical. Now, most of the time, encouraged by the cement and concrete industry, we think of concrete as something that belongs to the future. And we see buildings like this. This is Saarinen TWA terminal in New York, as objects which are clearly located within the future. They're built in the present, but they belong to the future. Concrete is something which is constantly talked about and has been ever since it first started being used as a material of the future. Its promise lies in the future. And what's quite curious about this is that this stuff's, it's been around for 120 years, and yet people are still talking about it as a material of the future. And yet quite clearly it has a past. It belongs to the past as well. Yet rarely do people seem to be able to represent this or deal with it. I mean, this is quite surprising because architectural culture is on the whole fascinated by its own past and with making references or negations of things that have happened in its past. But in relation to concrete, this is something that doesn't happen. It's very, very rare that you find people using concrete in a way that employs any kind of reference to its past existence, its past forms. A few exceptions I'll show you. This is Lina Bobardi's Sesci Pompeia building in Sao Paulo in Brazil. This is a sort of sports cultural complex. Got this extraordinary tower here which has sports halls in it which are connected to the changing rooms which are in this tower over here. And then this thing that looks like a factory chimney but is actually a water tower. And if you look at close up, the joints on the water tower are very messy like this. They're very ragged. And they're actually produced by each pore of the tower. It was a ring that was slightly conical and was placed upon the cast ring below, and then they shoved rags around the bottom of it loosely to keep the concrete in. And of course it produced this sort of runny edge. And this was deliberate, and it was deliberate as a tribute to this object, which are the satellite city towers in Mexico City, Barragan work previously. So this was a tribute to an earlier piece of concrete, which obviously also was Latin American. So it's a specifically Latin reference to the Latin Americanness of concrete. So this is a rare case of somebody using concrete in a knowingly historical way. The real exception that I've come across to attempts to historicize concrete were in post-war Italy. And there are quite a lot of buildings that you find in Italy were built in the 50s and 60s, where there was a quite deliberate employment of historical references to concrete. So this is the Church of the Autostrada outside Florence, Michelucci's Church of the Autostrada, which has this completely extraordinary structure inside it, which seems utterly illogical. Why these columns branch out and get thin and fat and then thin again and so on is completely inexplicable. And this is deliberate. I mean, what in a way Michelucci was doing was pointing two fingers at Nervi. Nervi, was the great rational concrete constructor, engineer, and Michelucci here is deliberately trying to introduce something quite irrational as a sign of contempt, really, for Nervi's concrete work. But at the same time, it refers to all sorts of other things. It refers to Rudolf Steiner's Goetheanum outside Basel, and so on and so on. It's full of quite knowing references to concrete and indeed also to Ronchamp as well, which you could see if I showed you another view of it. So this is a piece of concrete work which is knowingly historical. Here's another one. This is in Turin. This is the Borsa, the stock exchange in Turin, which again is a building that was intentionally mixed histories. So the lower part of the building is this stone, heavily rusticated stone facade, which is, I suppose, in the manner of Louis Sullivan. And then out of this grows a very rationalist form up here, which is clearly also reminiscent of Italian rationalism of the 30s. And so on. There are lots of other things, references to Art Nouveau in this building and so on. They mix up different architectural forms from history, but also introduce historical forms. So the interior of the hall looks like this, and you've got this weird roof, these webs, branching concrete in it, which are a tribute to Anatole de Baudeau's church in Paris, Saint-Jean-de-Montmartre. We know this because the architect of this building, Gabetti, was very interested in de Baudeau at the time and wrote about him. So this again, was a deliberate introduction of the history of concrete into this building. So this is something that's going on here, is a mixing up of times, if you like. They're making a building that's of the present for the future, but it employs elements of the past. But this is untypical of concrete construction. Next of these pairs, let's look at this one. This is about the universal and the local. Well, we know that concrete is everywhere. And it's often said that it makes everywhere the same. And that's what's disgusting about it. But if we take this is on the Nile. You have the domino system, so universal in the background. And you could find this anywhere. But at the same time, we know that concrete does get inflected towards particular cultures and particular nationalities. And there are lots of instances of this, and I'm just going to talk about a couple here. This is in Italy again. This is the Torre Velasca in Milan, built in the late 1950s. Was a very polemical building at the time when it was built, finished, because it seemed that this was a skyscraper that took the form of a Lombardic medieval fortress. It caused an enormous falling out amongst the architects of Siam, and in fact precipitated the breakup of Siam. However, what I'm interested in is the fact that it was a concrete skyscraper. Now, in the context of the 1950s, skyscrapers were American, but concrete was European. This had originally been conceived as a steel frame skyscraper, but for various reasons, and when the American backers, who were originally going to fund this building, withdrew from it, the structure was changed to concrete. And that immediately, in the context of the time, signified that this was a European building. This was not American because it was concrete. And furthermore, if you look at the finish of the building close up, what you'll see is that the surface of the building is hand finished. So you can see the marks up here of the craftsman's float as he's polished the surface, again down here, of the building. So this, bizarrely, is a skyscraper, you know, the modern form, which is meant to be produced by industrial methods, but in this case, hand finished. This is a craft work skyscraper built with the non-American medium of reinforced concrete. So there are these sorts of discussions about where concrete belongs. If we go closer to home, this is the Economist building in London, another concrete frame skyscraper which deliberately exposes, used to expose the concrete. It's since been covered up, but the front of the columns are faced in Portland stone, but the back of the columns is exposed concrete. And again, this is deliberate. Deliberate because the Smithsons, by the time they came to work on this building, had become disenchanted with American architecture. Although this is in some ways an American building, they at the same time wanted to make clear that it was not an American building. And the way to make it not American was to make it visibly concrete, because concrete wasn't an American medium. Skyscrapers didn't start, well, there had been concrete skyscrapers. I mean, this is a myth that, America is the land of steel, Europe is the land of concrete. But broadly speaking, certainly in the post-war era, skyscrapers in America were built of steel. They did start building them in concrete, and obviously the Twin Towers was a concrete structure. But at this point, mid-60s, Europe is concrete. So this is a case of concrete being used in order to signify something about nationality and national identity. I suppose the country which has identified it most closely with concrete is Japan. And we'll just say a little bit about Japan. This is the Church of Light in Osaka, Tadao Ando's Church of Light. And clearly there are things about the concrete of this building and of Ando's other buildings which have become seen as distinctively Japanese. It has this incredibly smooth finish, these very sharp arises on the corners. It's very even, and it's actually sort of polished with this, it has this slight sheen on the surface and so on. The Japanese have developed techniques for producing this superfine concrete. They've developed self-compacting concretes that don't need to be vibrated and so on, and which set with a very even, smooth finish. So there is a kind of technology that lies behind this. But the point is that the Japanese, from very early on, adopted concrete as the sign of Japaneseness in architecture. And the circumstances of this are as follows, that architecture is an alien concept in Japan, or was. It came from the West. So as soon as architecture arrived in Japan in the late 19th century, there were problems about it for the Japanese, because it's not Japanese. For anybody to be doing architecture, immediately identified them as non-Japanese, as Western. So the initial problem is, well, how are we going to accommodate this Western import into Eastern culture? And one of the ways in which they did this was thanks to concrete. And this is because Japanese is prone to earthquakes, as we know. And it was very quickly recognized that concrete could be used to make earthquake-proof buildings. And the Japanese developed techniques for producing anti-seismic structures, and developed an expertise in this, in which they really led the world. So concrete became the medium through which the Japanese architectural identity was able to represent itself in this kind of anti-seismic regime. There was a big earthquake in the 1920s, the same one as damaged Frank Lloyd Wright's Imperial Hotel, which was a concrete structure, and he was very pleased to say that it didn't do much damage to it. But as far as for the Japanese, far more significant in this earthquake was the fact that there was an American skyscraper, not a skyscraper, a big office building that had been built in steel. And this steel structure was very badly damaged in the earthquake. And the Japanese took delight in this because their own concrete structures withstood the earthquake. So this was proof that Japanese know-how in concrete construction was better and justified the existence of an authentic Japanese architecture. Let's look at one or two other Japanese works, just to say, kind of follow this up. This is not later than the Tangei building. This is than the Ando building. This is Tangei's prefecture at Takamatsu. And it's interesting that by Western standards, this is a poor use of concrete. There's too much concrete here. These beams are too close together. They double up unnecessarily at the corners. And if you look at these corner details, this is a very odd joint here that they lap over each other. And essentially what's happening here is that Tangei, like a lot of Japanese architects, is using concrete as if it were wood. They have no particular hesitation about treating concrete as a form of wood. And this is, in effect, how concrete gets accommodated into Japanese architecture. This use of concrete as if it was wood encourages an excess in the use of the material. Western eyes, as I say, would tend to see this as being at fault, this building, or certainly at the time when it was built in the late 50s. They saw it as being as fault because of it having too much concrete there. But within the terms of Japanese culture, this is not a problem. So there's a different way of understanding concrete. It has a local inflection, if you like. There's a way of thinking about concrete which is particular to Japan, which is not the same as that in other parts of the world. And there follows a different discourse around it as a result. So that's the sense of one might talk about material as being something that is national or can be used as being something that is attached to a particular nationality. The next of my polarities is about memory and amnesia. Now, normally speaking, concrete is blamed for erasing memory. It's said to be the stuff that makes us forget. As soon as you concrete over something, you've lost it, you've forgotten it. It obliterates the past, it obliterates memory of things. Now, the peculiarity is that it is so widely used as the material for memorials. It's the default material for making any reasonably large-sized memorial. This is Peter Eisenman's Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. But there are hundreds and hundreds of others. As soon as you start looking for them, start noticing them, you'll see them everywhere. Basically, it's the stuff out of which memorials get built. This is another one. This is in Paris. This is the one at the memorial to the martyrs of deportation, just at the end of the Ile de la Cité. And the puzzle is, well, why, if concrete is said to be the stuff that causes forgetfulness and obliterates memory, has it been so successful and so widely used as the medium of memory? And this is, I'm not sure that I can really answer this. This is a puzzle to me. But just as a sort of coda to this, if we take this structure, this is Rachel Whitetread's house. One of the questions about this when it was put up was whether this was a memorial or not. What she did was to make a cast of the inside of a house, which was then demolished. And what's left is the negative, if you like, of the house. So there was a house around this, the house is gone, this shows you the space inside. Now, the fact that it was made of concrete immediately made people think, it must be a memorial then. But to what? And this was the puzzle. Was it a memorial to the last guy who'd lived in the house? Was it a memorial to all the houses that had ever been in the street? All the houses that had ever been in London? What? Nobody really knew. And this was the sort of puzzle. But whether this was intentional or not on Whitetread's part, I'm not sure. But there's clearly some kind of connection which kind of bubbled up as a result of her using concrete as the medium for this work. And I mean, she did some other concrete, she did a concrete memorial in Vienna. But it's interesting that she subsequently stopped using concrete, and her later casts were generally in resin, because I think she saw it as being a memorial, memory-free substance, that it didn't attract these particular connotations. So there's a discussion there around concrete's place in memory. Okay, the next of these themes is about earth and spirit, base and spirit. Well, the starting point for this is the use of concrete for fortifications of all kinds, bunkers, protective shields, and so on. It's used where tremendous strength against aggression is called for. Or indeed you might see the object as being aggressive in themselves, but it has this reputation as being something that is being used heavily, particularly in the Second World War, for purposes of either aggression or resistance against aggression. So it has this kind of base association. This is what Virilio writes about so brilliantly in his bunker archaeology. But at the same time, concrete has been the medium of church building. It has become, in the 20th century, one of the most favoured mediums for building churches. So this is Perret's Notre-Dame du Raincy here, sometimes known as Notre-Dame du Béton Armé. And throughout the 20th century, it's been a preferred medium for church builders. Now, you might say this is because it's cheap, but that isn't entirely satisfactory, because cheapness is not a desirable quality necessarily in churches. So I think one has to look elsewhere. But it's a kind of curiosity, this. I mean, obviously, again, you'll think of lots of cases of these. We've seen the Michelucci Church, the Chiesa dell'Autostrada, and so on. A friend of mine was in conversation with the Bishop of Brentford on one occasion. You didn't know there was a bishop at Brentford, but there is. Brentwood. And the bishop said to him, "Concrete, God's gift to religion." So what's this all about? Well, there are various possible interpretations. In some cases, there's a kind of knowing reference to fortifications, to that tradition of concrete actually being a base material, which you obviously see here in La Tourette. But in other cases, there seem to be, what's all this about? And I mean, I think one of the preoccupations in the 20th century, in some parts of the world anyway, was a desire to make the church more masculine. There was a concern that religion was too much identified with women. It had lost vigor because it had become too closely identified with women. This is a preoccupation of the Catholic Church in the post-war period, 40s and 50s. And how to make it more masculine, how to make religion more vigorous. And it may be, I'd suggest, that this choice preference for concrete, in certain places anyway, was seen as being a solution to that. There are other arguments as well around it. Is it a way of conveying poverty? Maybe. How do you convey poverty in a church? What does poverty mean? This is something that Michelucci, we've seen Chiesa dell'Autostrada, the architect of this church, again, was very preoccupied with. And this is a very strange building because in some ways it seems to be terribly decorative, but in other ways it's incredibly austere. It seems really just to be a sort of shell with these openings punched in it. And part of Michelucci was, from what, reading what he was thinking about, was clearly preoccupied by this question of what poverty meant and what was the appropriate way to deal with this in a religious context. So these are some of the discussions that go on. Okay, next of these questions is about whether, this is in the Cold War era, whether concrete is communist or whether it's capitalist. Is concrete the material of communism as the widespread, very widespread use of concrete in the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries would lead us to suppose? The Soviet Union developed this concrete panel system, which at the height of its extent, I think, employed something like 30 million people making concrete panels, out of which things like this were built all over Russia and Eastern Europe, which linked, certainly in Western eyes, concrete with socialism, with Soviet communism. So in some contexts, it's seen as a socialist material. This is some leftover bits of a Soviet panel construction building. But at the same time, we know that concrete was heavily promoted for system building in the West. So this is a French panel system being employed in France. And indeed, the Soviets got the technology for building their own panel system from France. They sent some experts over to Western Europe in the 50s and basically modified the Camus system from France and used it for their own system. So it was originally a Western import. Did they have identical aims? Well, the Soviets were interested in concrete panel systems because of their consequences for labor. They were a way of getting rid of the distinction between skilled and unskilled labor. If you could make concrete panels in a factory and then assemble them on the site, everyone became a technician. So the discrepancy between unskilled and skilled labour, which is a problem within Soviet ideology, disappeared as soon as you started building using panel systems, because you could say everybody was a technician. In the West, the concern for interest in using these systems was rather different, and was primarily in order to speed up construction while not drawing skilled labour away from manufacturing industry. You could build concrete panel system buildings with unskilled labour without sucking labour away from productive industry, which would have a damaging effect on the economy. So there are economic reasons. So there are slightly different reasons why basically the same product emerges at the end. In the 1960s, all this came to a bad end. This is Ronan Point in East London, which collapsed as a result of a gas explosion that occurred somewhere up here in the early morning of May the 16th, 1968. The corner collapsed, proving that buildings like this were unsafe, and really putting an end to concrete panel systems as a way of building housing. And it's really from this point that concrete went out of favour in England and in most Western countries. The kind of disenchantment with it set in. And we've seen more recent kind of results of this, so that lots of concrete panel system buildings get demolished like this. And this became, in the 90s, a kind of regular event around London where these things would be blown up. This is one I witnessed, and the mayor who pressed the button of the detonator, as he did so, was pleased to announce that he was responsible for having demolished more tower blocks than any other mayor in London, or in England, I think. So this is, if you like, the undoing of concrete. It's not so easy in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. They've got other problems with concrete panel systems. Then finally, a discussion around labour. And what does concrete do for labour? Now, really the kind of critical thing here is whether concrete is low skill or high skill. And this is always something which is contentious, because on the one hand, concrete is said to be low skill. You don't need to be clever to do concrete. Only stupid people on the building site do concrete. It's always the occupation of low-paid immigrant workers and so on. So it has this reputation as being a low-skill stuff. But on the other hand, actually, to do concrete well requires quite a lot of skill, and particularly skill in making the formwork. It may not require that much skill to pour it, but making the formwork is skilled. And in that sense, concrete is a high-skill activity. Now, it depends on who you talk to and who they're talking to as to which of these two arguments about concrete takes precedence. If people are trying to justify concrete as being a cheap medium, then it's because it's low skill. But on the other hand, if they want to present it as being an exquisite medium, then it gets high skill. So there's always a controversy around this. And in some ways, the reliance of concrete upon skilled craftsmen to make the formwork has always been its Achilles heel, that it can never actually satisfactorily justify itself as being a low-skill activity, although it's often been presented as a process which lends itself to de-skilling in the building industry. It's much, good for building employers because it's a means of reducing the costs of labour, of de-skilling, and so on. This is a building worker on the unité d'habitation, incidentally. So the making of concrete is often the province of unskilled labour. This is a building site in New York in about 1907. These guys will be Italians. They're immigrants. They're handling the formwork here, which will have been made by more skilled craftsmen locally. Now, on the other side of the equation, though, concrete has created some skills, particularly of engineers. Might have been bad for building labour in its consequences in de-skilling, but for engineers, it's created lots of work. It's created a whole new occupation of the concrete expert. So these guys are in the drawing office of Ennebeek, who was the owner of the main proprietary system out of which most concrete buildings, the majority of concrete buildings were built in the pre-1914 period. And what these guys are doing is essentially taking designs that have been provided by architects and translating them into concrete so that they can be made out of concrete. So they have a particular expertise which they're deploying here. And they've been trained in the one of the Grande École in Paris in how to do this. And this indicates, this is an illustration of this new cadre of experts that comes into being through concrete. So it's good for engineers. What about architects? Well, it's kind of up and down, because at first, architects were quite worried about concrete because they thought they were going to lose out to the concrete experts, whom you've just seen in the last picture, and to the proprietary firms who were making concrete buildings. So they were afraid that they would lose business. But ultimately, I think architects have done rather well out of concrete, because what it's turned out is that they're the people who give a face to concrete. This is Erno Goldfinger, architect of Trellick Tower, which he's standing in front of. They're the people who interpret concrete. Architects have taken upon themselves or found a role for themselves in being the people who tell us what concrete is, if you like, who represent it as a medium to us. And this has been quite good for them. And also within architecture itself, concrete it's a virtuous medium. It's often seen as being the test of what a truly good architect is whether they can build in concrete. It's seen as being more difficult to do concrete. Partly, I think, because you have to do so much in advance. You've got to calculate, work everything out, where everything's going to go before it happens. And in this respect, this is a test of your ability as an architect. But certainly within architectural culture, there's a kind of view that if you can do concrete well, then, by God, you're a good architect. So in that respect also, it's given architects something to live up to, I think. Now, just to kind of draw this to a close, I'm going to stop in a moment. This sort of thing, this is the test of your skill as an architect. You don't have to spend very long listening to architects talking about concrete to realize that there's no agreement about the right way to do concrete. For every proposition, there almost invariably turns out to be someone, somewhere, who does exactly the opposite. There's always been this difficulty of being able to reach a consensus or an agreement as to what the proper way to do it is. There aren't any rules, actually, within concrete. Now, this, to me, is one of the most interesting things about it as an architectural medium. And to me, the most rewarding treatments of concrete are when an architect realizes that more than one situation is valid. That if you take any of the polarities that I've been talking about, that each has the possibility of being both at once. And that architects who've managed to grasp this and to see that there's no point or no virtue in trying to keep keep concrete within one category, are the people who seem to me to have got the measure of it and made the most of it. So I would look always for cases of where architects seem to have managed to deal with the two ends of any particular polarity, and to do that successfully. There's an essay by Frank Lloyd Wright, which he wrote in 1927 on concrete, in which he says that concrete is neither one thing nor another. This seems to me to be pretty accurate. He calls it a mongrel material, in fact. I'd accept this. Lots of other people have pointed it out before. It's quite well known about concrete, but it seems to me that it's something that people have been reluctant to acknowledge, and I'd like to think about that ambivalence that seems to be present within anything to do with concrete. Okay, I'm stop. Okay.
Do we have some questions? There should be a mic somewhere back there.
I mean, I'm really struggling to see the purpose of the book, if that is summary of the content of the book, for the following reason. In a way, the concrete is not presented, the buildings are not presented with a context, with a time frame of when they were created, how they changed. It's always looked in just isolation. Is this example and that example and that example. And somehow I could see the same book written with the title The Motor Car and Culture, and just follow the development of 120 years of change, of how the wheels improved and this and that, and how different cultures at some certain point were doing different designs. So it's difficult. I mean, what are you trying, what is really, I mean, what are you trying to bring to the table as, what is the purpose of the publication?
I could have written a book about the motor car in the same terms, but I chose to write one about concrete. It's a maybe arbitrary decision, but that's what I chose to do. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to understand something about it as a medium. I'm trying to understand something about the place that materials occupy within the culture of building architecture. Well, that's a kind of matter of dispute. It ages all too fast, in some people's view. And basically, if you talk to a concrete expert, they'll say every concrete building is a disaster waiting to happen. It's, it's carbonation is going to destroy it. How are we going to keep it up? That's, would be a concrete expert's view of it. It ages terribly.
But the thing is that you have more than enough examples to basically look. And I mean, there are 40 years old concrete buildings, there are 60 years old concrete buildings, there are 100 years old concrete buildings. And in fact,
Yeah.
you can just see them in the context of the climate. I mean, I remember the only concrete building that I've seen that actually it was really in a great shape was Louis Kahn Salk Institute in La Jolla. Why is that? Because it doesn't rain, because the climate never changes in an extreme way. As simple as that. But it's looked into its own context. And just to look in images of like different buildings and just say like, oh, here's a bit of a Japanese kind of interpretation of
It seems to me
timber.
you're having difficulty kind of actually seeing that the lecture is not about buildings as such. I mean, it's about concrete. And maybe I could sort of go back to just ask the question. I mean, it seems to me, you know, by setting up these polarities, and concrete being responsible, in a sense, for producing them, you know, if you look at sort of the role of polarities in particular cultures like ancient Greece, you know, the thing that produces the polarity has an incredibly important cultural kind of value. I mean, it's that which produces both the separation and the connection. So in that sense, you know, the anthropological importance of concrete would seem to be very well demonstrated by the table of sort of polarities.
I think he's right.
And maybe the sort of horror, maybe which you linked to its kind of mongrel state, is also really in the kind of fluid solid.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that seemed to me in a sense was a polarity which could have been given, that it actually undergoes this metamorphosis.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Do you want a microphone? You need a microphone, Joanna. Why have I avoided the Romans? Because we don't know anything about the discourse around concrete amongst the Romans. You know, we know they did it, and we know what people have thought about it since then, but we have no sense of what it was within Roman culture. So anything we'd say about it would be a modern view of it. I mean, you could talk about it, but we can guess. Yes, yeah.
Sounds as there ought to be a character in Asterix called Ferroconcretus.
Yes. Yeah. The question at the back.
Yeah, hello. How do you define the polarities and the paradoxes, like unhistorical, historical? How do you actually define and what is historical and what is not historical, what is advanced and what is not advanced? Because when I saw the actual photo of like the Peruvian like little houses, or even the favela in Brazil, or like the Sao Paulo University, you're in a way saying that advanced, those buildings that you showed, the universities, for example, they are buildings of power. Okay, they are buildings that hold kind of some sort of like authority. And inside those buildings, like maybe more immoral and evil things happen than in the actual buildings of like Peru. You're actually saying that that advanced and holds some sort of like quality of power, and the unadvanced or like backwards is kind of like a Peruvian house where like can have perfect and nice pretensions and don't hold like a powerful party in society, I guess. So how do you define those paradoxes, and how do you?
I don't see this as a problem. It seems to me that this is something that's present in most cases that you look at, that there's actually an element of both going on. I mean, the examples that I've chosen are arbitrary in a way. They're not. They just seem to be perhaps slightly clearer than. I'm sorry. Well, actually, I'd say that maybe in the case of the Peruvian shanty town, that the question of whether it's advanced or backward possibly doesn't matter. It's not an issue. That actually, if you look at it from that perspective, that whole question goes away. And you then wonder, well, why has the West spent so much time worrying about this question of whether they're advanced and backward or not? That would be that's my kind of thought about that.
Is there a question about concrete?
Don't ask me, I'm the expert.
With regards to modern architecture in this country, it's been seen as something of a necessary evil. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how people perceive it in this country.
Well, as I say, at the beginning, with a certain amount of disgust, depends who you're talking to. Generally speaking, with nausea, disgust, but equally amongst architects as something that's exquisite, that you can use as a bespoke material that does all sorts of rather wonderful things. There isn't a singular point of view. I think that's part of the interest of it, is that it changes so much according to who you're talking to at on what occasion. There's a nice. I remember hearing Kathy Clark from MUF talking about a building that they'd done, and they were proposing a building that covers a Roman mosaic in St Albans, and they were presenting it to the local authority, and she just got around to describing what it was going to be made of, and she said, and it's going to be made of concrete, and she saw the faces of the councillors drop, and then she added, and it's going to be covered with mussel shells. And it was all right. They got the commission. Any other? Irena?
Methodological question more than anything. It's not about concrete. But you said at the beginning of the lecture that you didn't want this to be a book about case studies.
Mm.
But it ends up being a series of case studies. And I was just intrigued, or examples. I was just intrigued I'd be interested to know more about what constitutes a case study as opposed to exemplifying certain themes through various projects.
Well, normally speaking, the case study is made to kind of bear the narrative. In the way in which I've used them, I've tried to treat them as something which suggests a thought, which connects with some larger theme. They exemplify something, but the purpose is not to make them. It's not a story about 101 wonderful concrete buildings. But it's a problem, that, which I must say I've been conscious of, is how do you avoid what could easily become lots of case studies. Either you write something which is completely abstract, which totally deals with generality, which I guess probably wouldn't be terribly interesting to most people to read, or you introduce some examples so that people can see maybe what I've been thinking about and what. And in many cases, it's from looking at the examples that the thought occurred, or looking at lots of examples produced a thought about it. So I've obviously only talked about a few things, and it's been an effect of this evening's talk that maybe I've foregrounded the cases more than is actually what I would like to do, but it seems to be necessary for the purposes of providing a reasonably entertaining evening for you.
Could I just ask a last question, and to ask you really to pursue a little bit, what you learned about, especially I think the English dislike of concrete. I mean, obviously it's not universal. It's one of those things which I think it's not unreasonable to start by saying it's a kind of savage, petty bourgeois kind of dislike. Or another way of putting that, perhaps in a more architectural context, is it seems to be, in some sense, a suburban loathing. If one thinks of the private housing of the suburbs, then it frequently seems like in opposition to that. So the fact that, in some sense, modernism came in largely through initially kind of social housing is a way in which a certain kind of almost class division in respect to materials gets kind of taken up into an aesthetic. But maybe you think that's extravagant.
I don't want to denigrate people's dislike of the material. I don't want to put people down and say, oh, you've got no taste because your tastes are petty bourgeois because you don't like this. It seems to me that if somebody doesn't like something, it's a perfectly valid emotion to have, and I'd respect it. But at the same time, I'd be interested in understanding why that arises. So to me, that's the puzzle.
No, I agree. I mean, if someone says I don't like it, I think that's fine, as long as they're not petty bourgeois as well. Okay, I think that's probably the last question.
Yeah,
and Adrian, I'd like to thank you for an extremely interesting talk. We look forward to the actual post-Amazonian
yes.
publication, and indeed the republication of the Words and Buildings. Adrian, thank you very much indeed.